talk about things that cinema and the other kinds of creation they can, how they are intersect with one and the others. And this year we do a symposium about surveillance, fiction and reality, about Big Brother, how things are now.
Very timely.
And my son, and we are here to talk with you, my son, because we do it with in accordance and with the help with Julian Assange and Balthazar Garçon and a lot of other intellectuals, and
close to it, be quiet. Did you have an interview with Assange?
Yes, my son knows him very well, and
So you visited him?
Yeah, twice in January and May, and I should come back there.
How's he making out?
He's worse than before. It's more difficult than before, and
Getting stir crazy.
yeah, I mean he's trying to maintain a public face that is still like
Just living in such constraints.
Yes, it's starting to be very harsh. Yeah, and embassy is starting to put more and more restrictions on the visits, etc. So, did you meet him for the interview?
Never met him. By the time I got to know him, he was already expressing it.
Yeah. And what and we do it with as well with people close to Snowden, and we try to do really a reflection about how is what is the surveillance now in terms of global surveillance and everything, and how the society takes it, because I think it's we go very far than the Big Brother, and everybody is accepting that without America. And it's about all this that I think my son will do a talk with you if you don't mind.
Out of curiosity, how did people your age in Italy respond to the Snowden revelations?
I'm living in France.
Oh, you live in France? Let's say there.
It's very interesting because in the elites, so in the best universities, there is quite a debate still, in particular, less with Snowden, who has quite an accepted figure. He's an accepted figure, like he's really well considered in general. More about people like Assange, and there's a lot of controversy about if their action is good, if they can be supported or not. There are a lot of debates and doubts. But
what kinds of criticisms come up?
They're very skeptical about the reasons he's entered this struggle with IS. And for example, it's not. For example, they consider that la raison d'etat, which is called la raison d'etat in French, can justify the fact that secrets.
You find that among
Yeah. So but really in the narrow, very elitist, and the further you go into society, deeper in the country, and the more admired they are, without compromise.
I'm asking because just small experiment with my own grandchildren and their friends who are in their 20s. They didn't seem to care. They said, yeah, kind of interesting, but we put everything on Facebook anyway, so what do we care?
That's interesting.
It's about that, what is the discussion? How how do we arrive on that? How do we arrive in this kind of, acceptance of the society of all these control that any of us now know that we
Here, at least the sort of teenage, 20-ish society is so exhibitionist that they just don't seem to care if anyone knows everything they're doing.
Yeah, there is also a distinction between the fact, so many young people know them even when they're not politicized, and they treat them as heroes, but it doesn't provoke any kind of mobilization.
Reaction.
Yeah, it just stays as a perception, and
I mean, were people that surprised by what was revealed?
yes,
They were.
I mean, it's the discourse of people like Assange before was seen as.
Do they follow WikiLeaks?
Yes, there is there is knowledge about this, but it was considered as a bit paranoid. All these disqualifications that can be attributed to anti-system discourse. That was, I think that's, I don't know what you think about it, but I think that's why Snowden's revelations were so important, because it revealed that it legitimized their discourse, the discourse of those who were warning about Echelon, about these Mars surveillance.
Something that were onto something. They didn't know the least of it. Yeah.
Why did you sign I mean, I saw that you signed a few weeks ago a manifest, an appeal for Snowden, to support Snowden. Why did you decide to enter into this?
I started right away, immediately. I thought what he was doing was extremely important. I was quite vocal about it.
And how did you, I mean, do you see it as an American, a problem of American hegemony, or a more global problem?
To some extent or other, every government does it. Yes. So, for example, some of the interesting Snowden revelations had to do with England. Turned out that in England, the government was requesting the United States to use its advanced technology to spy on British citizens. I mean, any system of power is going to want to have total information about its enemies, and the domestic population is one of the main enemies. This goes way back. I don't know if you've studied the history, but if you haven't, a major book to look at is Albert McCoy's. Have you seen that?
Yes.
Studied Philippines.
Yes.
The United States pioneered all of these things 100 years ago. When after the U.S. conquered the Philippines, they killed a couple 100,000 people, but they had to pacify the place, and they developed using the highest technology of the day. It's not now, but they tried to gather massive information about Philippine elites. Basically, they didn't have the technology to go beyond that, and they recognized that if they knew enough information about them, they could use it to undermine organization, to discredit people, to incite conflicts among people, and basically break up the independent nationalist movements. And it was quite successful. It's so successful that if you take a look at East Asia today, Southeast and East Asia, there's a kind of famous Asian miracle, with one exception, the Philippines, which is not participating. It's been under U.S. control for a century, and it remains a dependent third world society. Has never, and furthermore, in a pretty astonishing achievement of propaganda, Filipinos have been so indoctrinated that they tend to support the U.S. and its crimes beyond other people, even though they are the main victims. That's a real achievement. And it's now over 100 years, and as McCoy discusses, as soon as these methods were developed for the Philippines, they were immediately transferred back home. So Woodrow Wilson used the same techniques in the Red Scare, the big repression and post-World War I period. And they were picked up by the FBI, and it sort of goes on from there. The same happened in England. Systems of power are very much afraid of their own populations, and with good reason. And gaining information and using it to control people, find out what they're doing, discredit them, undermine them. That's a standard technique.
And that's a question I wanted to ask.
Incidentally, if you've read the reports in the last couple of days about these 42 Israeli intelligence agents, remember you saw that?
Yeah.
Take a look at what they're describing. The work that they were doing is exactly what
it's strengthening it. And at the same time, we can see someone like Edward Snowden, for example, that comes out alone, denouncing
It's dangerous.
these issues.
I mean, in a way, McCoy is dangerous too, but he's so obscure that they don't go after him. It's, he's a major figure in scholarship, but who knows?
But the question would be how can it be understood that someone as Snowden could counter these two massive tools that are joining together and counter the discourse, the state discourse.
Notice that he's paying quite a cost.
Yeah, of course.
Well, you remember, maybe it was a year ago or so, when Evo Morales flew to Russia to see him. The European countries are so frightened of the United States. I mean, European cowardice is unbelievable. So frightened that countries like, say, France, wouldn't allow the plane to cross their airspace for fear that the United States might be angry at them. When the plane was finally forced to land in Austria, the Austrian police sent a police in. This is a presidential plane. It's a gross violation of every imaginable diplomatic principle, but nobody complained because they're just terrified of the United States.
But at the same time, we can see that the discourse of Snowden is the discourse of Snowden, the denunciation of these methods is very pervasive and the counter discourse of the state doesn't seem to be working in the end. How can you explain that an individual?
As you said, it to some extent is working.
Mm-hmm.
People claim there's own data justifies it. It's this. Take a look at Israel now, right now. These reservists are being denounced across the spectrum. Almost everyone. I mean, not everyone. You find the fringe, but the Labour Party is supposed to be left, whatever that means. Over the right wing, they all think you ought to be killed.
But that's interesting. For example, in Israel, maybe 20 years ago, it was possible to have a public debate about these policies. And what brings that change? How can
the occupation? Actually, that was predicted right away in 1967. Right away, one of there's a highly respected figure in Israel. It's not dead. Yeshayahu Leibovitz. But in Israel, he was a kind of sage, traditional sage, Talmudic expert, biologist, taught at university, very respected. He said, right, pre-reactionary, incidentally. And so he's a traditional, he belongs to traditional Jewish culture. Nothing matters except what's good for the Jews. Actually, I had interviews with him. He was bitterly condemning the occupation. And I asked him, what about the effect on the Arabs? He said, he doesn't care what happens to the Arabs. He cares about what happens to Jews. He's like my grandfather and my great-grandfather. The Goyim don't matter. But it's bad for the Jews. And what he pointed out right away is that the occupation is going to turn Israelis into what he called Judeo-Nazis. They're going to become like Nazis because when you have your boot on somebody's neck, you have to find a way to justify it. And pretty soon you make up the justifications and then you internalize the justifications and pretty soon you're a raving racist. That's what he predicted in, must have been 1967 or 68. And you can see it happening. It's, the dynamics are perfectly predictable. I mean, that's what happens when you are crushing someone. You don't say, I'm a monster, so I'm going to crush them. You say, I'm doing it for their good, and they're the ones who are causing the problem. Well, the problem is that they're resistant. Otherwise, you get people like Golda Meir, his famous statement about how she hates the Arabs because they're forcing us wonderful Jews to shoot them, which we don't want to do because we're so moral. And by now it's spread across the sky. But it's part of the dynamics of oppression. It was the same with slave owners. In fact, it's the same with parents and children. Often in kind of quasi-pathological situations. say I'm benevolent and decent, and I'm sort of forced to do unpleasant things because they're so bad.
And do you see a similar trigger moment with the U.S.? Like
The U.S. politics, well, that goes way back to the origins of the society. I mean, after all, this society, the United States, was based on two fundamental principles. One is extermination of the native population, and the other was slavery, and both were justified. You take when I was growing up as a child, we would play cowboys and Indians, where we would be the cowboys killing the Indians, because we have to defend ourselves from these terrorists. Maybe they still do it. I don't know. But it's, and I was growing up in a kind of a progressive environment. But it's with regard to slavery today, the problem with blacks, even Obama says this, the problem with blacks is they just have a bad culture. Why? Does it have to do with 500 years in which of slavery and its aftermath, which is really never ended? No, it's because something bad about them. So that's the way you deal with it, and I think it's universal. I mean, I once, back in the 1960s, a friend of mine who worked for the Rand Corporation, the government research, Tony Russo, who was later involved in releasing Pentagon Papers, a couple of years earlier, he sent me a pile of documents which were quite interesting. The Rand Corporation had translated Japanese counterinsurgency literature from the 1930s because they were interested in what their counterinsurgency techniques were. And it was pretty interesting. It was, of course, the same as the ones the U.S. was then using in Vietnam. It was kind of universal. But what was interesting about them was that I wrote about it. These are internal documents, not for the public. Just talk to each other. No reason to lie or anything. And they described themselves. This is a time when the Japanese were carrying out horrifying atrocities all over the Nanking Massacre, all kinds of things in China and Manchuria. But they were describing themselves as noble, the most noble people who were trying to bring an earthly paradise to the Chinese and to defend the Chinese people against the Chinese bandits, the nationalists and of course the communists who were trying to prevent Japan from bringing the advantages of high technology and advanced civilization to these backward people. And they were sacrificing themselves for the cause and so on. And it's the same when you read the U.S. literature, the British literature. I read a review recently in the Time, I think it was the Times Literary Supplement, kind of establishment journal, but a good historian of imperialism, Bernard Porter, pretty mainstream. He was reviewing a couple of books on the British Empire up until the mid-19th century. And he pointed out that if we, the British, are ever willing to face the history of our own empire, we will rank our heroes alongside the genocidaire of the 20th century. But a long time before that will happen, they're still heroes.
And just one thing, something that for me is very strange is how to, the acceptance by, for example, senators and congressmen now in the States, the idea that they are being controlled and nothing happens. Before, you remember Watergate, something like that, something like the kind of trying to know something, from, in a way that he was not legal, was completely, one president just fall. But now they know exactly they are being controlled, the congressmen and the senators, and they don't react at all. They just do things wrong.
If they're being controlled, it's by private corporate capital. They're not being controlled by the White House, which can't do very much to them. In fact, take a look at Watergate. Why was Watergate considered such a scandal? Think about it. So Nixon was a crook. Nixon had an enemies list, which was terrible. How can he dare have an enemies list? I was on that. And nothing ever happened to him on the enemies list. But it wasn't a fuss because I was on it. It was because people like the head of IBM were on it, and George Bundy was on it. And how can you call important people bad names in private? Horrible. They broke into, he had a bunch of crooks who broke into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. Okay, that's a crime. But is it a major crime? Take a look at what Nixon was doing at that time. There were major crimes, but they didn't figure in Watergate. So right at the time that Watergate was exposed, the very same time, something else was exposed. The COINTELPRO. This is a program by the National Political Police, the FBI, through 4 administrations. Began with Eisenhower, went through Kennedy and Johnson, was still going on under Nixon. It was a program that began by a subversive, an attack on the Communist Party, then it spread to the Puerto Rican independence movement, to the Native American movement, pretty soon to the New Left, the women's movement. And it was a program just of the kind we're talking about, using every technique possible to undermine and discredit and destroy dissent. And it was pretty serious. One of the main targets was black nationalists, and they were simply massacred. Right at the time, one of the worst cases was, which was exposed right with Watergate, was the murder of a black ACT organizer, Fred Hampton, in Chicago by the Chicago police in a typical Gestapo raid, literally. The police attacked at 4 o'clock in the morning, murdered him in bed. He was probably drugged, murdered somebody else who was with him. This was all set up by the FBI. And the FBI had tried to get some other black group to kill him. They wouldn't do it, so they set it up with the police. That's a Gestapo-style assassination of somebody who's organizing the black community. I mean, that single event is incomparably worse than the whole Watergate story. I mean, I wrote about it. Anybody else? And in fact, even that was nothing. I mean, the worst crime of the Nixon administration was the bombing of Cambodia.
Yes.
I mean, rural Cambodia was bombed literally at the level of all Allied bombings during, and all of the entire Pacific area during World War II. Rural Cambodia. Nixon's orders, transmitted by his loyal servant, Henry Kissinger, were anything that flies against anything that moves. I mean, that's a call for genocide of a kind you just can't find in the historical record. I mean, if they found anything like that for Hitler, let's say, or for Milosevic, everybody would be overjoyed. But you can't. You can only find it for Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. Does anybody care? No. I mean, Watergate was considered a crime because important people were mildly harmed, very mildly harmed. And mild harm to important people means the foundations of the Republic are collapsing.
And you don't think that now they feel that are being controlled by NSA as well?
How are they being controlled? I mean, am I controlled by NSA? Are you controlled? Yeah, okay, so if they want, they can pick up all my emails. Well, I don't like it, but I'm not paying any attention to it. And there's no reason for anyone in Congress to be controlled. I mean, they were controlled by the FBI, but that's long before the NSA. I mean, Hoover was using the techniques devised in the Philippines to get information about everyone in Washington. So he would get that's one of the main things the FBI was doing, trying to get information about people in the political class so you could blackmail them. You could come to a senator and tell him, look, if you do so-and-so, I'm going to, you hint, you don't tell him, oh, really hint that you'll release the fact that he's having an affair with his secretary. So then he shuts up. But that Scale is different, but the scale reflects the availability of the technology. If if they ever develop techniques to say pick up your brain waves, your brain produces electric signals. Maybe someday in science fiction they'll pick up a way to pick up your brain waves. Okay, we'll do that, and then blackmail you because you're thinking of something, whatever. And you said that's what systems of power are like. So that's why the Philippine story is so interesting and should really be studied. And that's the first modern version. I mean, it goes way back, but first modern version with the high technology of the day was the Philippines, and it's been fantastically effective. For one thing, it came back immediately to the United States and was used for the worst repression in American history, Wilson's Red Scare. But also, as I say, after 110 years, Philippines are still controlled uniquely in the region. Dramatic.
And you think that any power, that power can only, that this asymmetry and mass propaganda and control of the masses is inherent to power, or do you think
it's inherent to power to try? It's not inherent to succeed. That depends on whether people resist it.
And that's because you were saying before that it's a universal. You think it's a universal.
It's universal to try.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's extremely hard to find any structure of power and hierarchy and domination where those who wield the club won't try to be as effective as possible. I mean, it's not totally universal. There are people who refuse to do it, but it's a strong tendency.
And do you think that individual tentatives to resist and try to subvert this?
Sure, that's what popular movements have always been about.
It starts with individuals, you think?
It starts with it's organized groups of individuals, which starts with individuals. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's how we have a lot more rights than we had 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But it wasn't gifts from above, always popular struggle. It's true whether you're talking about abolitionism, rights of women, opposition to aggression, concern about the environment, just pick it. It's always popular activism of some sort or other.
So this popular activism, you think they should only aim at to obtain or protect rights? Or, do you think this, because there is a trend in this resistance movement, pacific or not, to gain power in order to obtain these results? But
that's a mistake, because if they gain power, they're going to do the same.
So you think
what they ought to be trying to do is to diffuse power, so nobody has power.
So you think you can stay outside the power and still?
I think, in fact, that's been done. I mean, the transition from, say, kings to parliamentary democracy is an important step. It doesn't eliminate power, but it's parliamentary, say, the government of the United States has much less power than a king would have had 4 centuries ago.
But is this power coming to the people back or to corporations?
Controls. There are popular controls over what the government can do. There are constraints. And they work. Maybe not well, but they work. So take, say, the Vietnam War. Take a look at what happened through the 1960s. There was, at the beginning, there was almost no opposition. And it was shocking. But finally, by the late 60s, opposition developed. At that point, the Johnson administration began to run into economic problems. The problem was that they had to fight what was called the guns and butter war. They had to keep the population quiet and controlled because there was so much opposition to the war that you had to kind of keep people pacified. One result of that is they could never call a national mobilization. During the Second World War, where people were really committed to the war, there was a national mobilization. So people were willing to accept wage controls, rationing, keeping dry, to eat meat, and so on and so forth, because they wanted to win the war. Johnson had been able to call a national mobilization, the Vietnam would have been totally crushed. It was practically destroyed anyway. It would have been crushed. He couldn't do it. Too much opposition. And the result was that what was called stagflation, a combination of stagnation or inflation. The business world didn't like that. And in fact, by 1968, after the Tet Offensive, which indicated the war was going to go on for a long time, the business classes turned against the war and were influential in forcing Johnson and later Nixon into some kind of negotiation. That's the way power systems like to look at it. They say, well, no, business is so benevolent, they decided we shouldn't do this. No, that's not what happened. It began to harm their interests. And the reason it harmed their interests is because of popular opposition. And actually it goes beyond that. Take a look at the Pentagon Papers, which is quite interesting. One of the most interesting parts is the very end, where the Pentagon Papers ends in mid-1968 history, internal history. That's after the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a remarkable event. Among other things, it made it clear the war was going to go on for a long time. Johnson, president, wanted to send more troops to Vietnam. The top military was opposed. What they said is, if we do that, we're going to have domestic problems. We're going to need those troops for population control in the United States. There's going to be an uprising of young people and women and minorities and others, and we'll need them for civil control. Well, that's an indicator, and in fact, it was effective. What happened was horrible enough. Could have been a lot worse. Well, in fact, if you look back, say, at Nazi Germany, totalitarian state, you find pretty much the same thing. Someday, if you haven't done it, read the memoirs of Albert Speer. He's the Nazi economic czar. Yeah, 1 second. His memoirs are kind of interesting. What he says is probably accurate. He says that the military effort was impeded by the fact that the population wasn't really that too much committed to the war. So we had to carry out a guns and butter war. We had to pacify them. And that took resources away from the war. And what he claims is that I think he said that it maybe lost a year or something. I don't remember exactly. If he's right, that was the difference between victory and defeat. Germany was technologically much more advanced than the West. I mean, jet planes, rockets, all sorts of things. But they were kind of overwhelmed by sheer mass, mostly Russian. But if they had more time, who knows, maybe they would have won the war. Well, that's popular opposition in a totalitarian state. Populations just can't be totally disregarded. And there are achievements, like a lot of these human rights aren't perfect by any means, but it's a big advance over the centuries.
You think that these individual, action of Snowden and Assange, not individual, the community, that will change something in the future in terms of how things sorted?
It's up to us. They did what they could. From now on, it's up to the people who got the information, thanks to their courageous actions. If you decide to do nothing, then it won't change.
In the States, nothing changed, you think, until now?
Not much. I mean, some has. So, for example, by now there are some constraints on government action. Not much, but some. And there could be more. But that's up to people like us. Same in France, same in Italy, same anywhere else. I mean, there are other governments are doing the same things, just not on this scale.
50 years ago, you were a public enemy. Today, you were a public enemy 50 years ago. Today, Snowden is another. Even a public enemy from the inside, so it's even worse. You think there will be still another one in 50 years? You think it's a permanent?
Same answer. That's up to us.
But you think that there can be a society in which we will not?
Oh, yeah.
is, I mean, because it's something that is under in your purpose is the question of legality, of resistance to legality, or I mean, is it legitimate to go not just only as Snowden as a punctual act, but now in order to change the system, do we have to respect the frame of legality that has been imposed, or?
So, the kind of null hypothesis, unless there's an argument to the contrary, we follow the laws. So if I drive home tonight and there's a traffic light that's red, I'll stop. On the other hand, if I see that across the street somebody's being murdered, maybe I'll go through it and I won't stop. Well, you do normally obey the laws unless there are reasons not to. And a lot of the laws are unacceptable. They shouldn't exist.
And so maybe we can.
And in fact, the worst lawbreakers by far are the powerful. Actually, a couple of friends and I have a letter today in the New York Times, which is pointing out the obvious that all the discussion about whether Obama should approach Congress for authorization of the war was basically beside the point. There are higher laws, real laws, under the U.S. Constitution. Valid treaties are the supreme law of the land. The major valid treaty is the UN Charter that bans the threat or use of force. So if a law-abiding state would not even be able to discuss these issues, but a rogue state like the United States, where nobody cares about the law, they can do it.
So, yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you
For your time.
I wanted to ask you about, you told us yesterday about the continuity between the practices of the United States that were tried in the Philippines in the early 20th century and what is today mass surveillance. And you also talked about the fact that this control on population and more generally the confrontation between state and population was very rooted in the foundations of the US with the genocide of the Native Americans and other events. I wanted to know if you consider that this mass surveillance is just another tool in this tool of governmentality, for example, if we use the Foucault words, which doesn't create any difference, only a difference in scale and no breaking of any kind.
Well, differences in quantity sometimes become differences in quality. My impression is it's basically a difference in scale. So the practices that were developed in detail to control the Philippine population back in the early 20th century, which were aimed mostly at elites, not so much at the peasantry. They kind of disregarded them. And were very successful in breaking up the nationalist movements and imposing the US-dominated system, which so successful that it remains until today. As I think I mentioned, the Philippines are kind of an outlier in East and Southeast Asia, the one area that hasn't really developed and has not plenty of struggles, a lot of brutality. So, for example, after the Second World War, the U.S. backed a vicious counterinsurgency operation to crush peasant independent rebellions. But basically the system has sustained itself. And it was applied at once at home. This is like 1910. By 1918, 1919, a few years later, pretty much the same systems were applied at home in what is, in fact, the most repressive period of American history, the Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare, which was quite vicious and had a long time impact. And then it continues. The FBI used the same techniques to try to, again, aim mainly at the political elite, to try to ensure that the senators, congressional representatives, others would not get out of line because they'd have a ton of information about them and they could use it to slander them, to libel them, to initiate stories and so on. By the 1960s and 70s, it was being directed against the entire population. That's the COINTELPRO operations, primarily under the Democratic administrations of the 60s and then Nixon when it was finally terminated by the courts, but very similar operations, but in this case directed against the Native American movements, the New Left, the Black nationalist movements, the women's movements, and it was pretty serious. It led as far as literal political assassination, forcing suicides, breaking up groups, and that was a massive operation. It's pretty hard to think of, I mean, outside of, say, East Germany and so on, it's hard to think of a comparable operation in a Western society aimed at undermine the state. And it's the state, it's the national political police, that's what the FBI is, under executive orders, trying to break up and disrupt popular activism, which was quite a significant force in the 60s and early 70s, and had substantial success. This now takes it up on a broader scale. But this is the kind of thing you'd expect a system of power to do. The more information they have about people, the better able they are, at least think they are, to control and monitor and undermine them if necessary.
So that's also the you think power can exist? So there is this idea that information is power, and your activism is very linked to this idea that you have to empower people by providing them accurate information on the world and in the different structures of power. Do you think that do you think that secret is necessary to form a power? Do you think that
secrecy is valuable? Actually, the United States is an unusually open society. We have more access to internal planning records in the United States than any country that I know of. It's by no means perfect, but it's substantial. And when you read through these masses of internal documents, secret documents, as I've done in many cases, one thing is quite striking. Very little has any meaningful relation to any real security issue. Most of it is defending the state against the population. They don't want people to know what they're doing, so it's secret. But there's very little in the secret record that would have been of value, let's say, to the Russians or the Chinese or whoever, the Cubans, whoever they thought they were fighting. They usually knew it perfectly well just from what was happening on the ground. But it does maintain secrecy from the population. And the tacit assumption is, sometimes overt, that people shouldn't know these things. There is, after all, it's worth remembering, a leading theme of liberal, progressive, democratic theory, which says that people should not know. You find that expressed overtly often in some of the leading figures. So the leading public intellectual of the 20th century in the United States, Walter Lippmann, who was a very distinguished figure. He was a progressive Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy-style progressive leading commentator on public affairs. He was also the author of what are called essays in progressive democratic theory. And when you read them, what he says is, I'll quote, he says, the public are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. They have to be put in their place. Decisions have to be made by the responsible men, people like us. The people who write this are always among the responsible men. We, the responsible men, have to be protected from the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd, the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. The job of what he called manufacturing consent, I borrowed his term for a book, but it's his. The job of manufacturing consent is to ensure that the public is marginalized, put in their place in his phrase. They can be spectators, but not participants. They do have a role in a political system. Every couple of years, they're allowed to lend their weight to one or another of the responsible men, and then they should go home and keep quiet. And this is quite common. I mean, the founder of modern political science, Harold Lasswell, one of the leading figures, also a kind of a progressive, by U.S. standards, a leftist progressive. He said we should not be misled by democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interests. They're not. They're too stupid, they're too ignorant. It would be unfair to allow them to make decisions, kind of like letting a 3-year-old ride to the street. They're not capable. So for their own benefit, we should control them, limit what they do, keep them to the status of observers, spectators of what happens in the political arena. And this is pretty much the way things work. So if you look at academic political science in the United States, one of the major topics that it studies, and studies very well, is the relation between public attitudes and public policy. It's a straightforward inquiry. Public policy, you see it. Public attitudes are available from extensive polling. Polling isn't perfect, but it's pretty good and pretty reliable, and often polls are done quite sensibly. And there's a massive information about public attitudes and public policy, and there are results in the major, kind of gold standard works of political science. Basic result is that about 70% of the population, lower 70% on the income scale, is literally disenfranchised. Their attitudes have absolutely no effect on policy. Their representatives pay no attention to them, literally. So whatever they think is disregarded. As you move up the scale, you start getting a little more influence, that is, more relation between attitudes and policy. And when you get to the very top, which is a fraction of 1%, they're basically making policy. And so they get what they want. This little fuzziness around the edges, but that's the basic picture. Just recently, there was a study released by Princeton University, which got a little publicity. 2 leading political scientists who've worked on these things for years investigated, I think, about 1,700 major public policy decisions to investigate who had influence. Same result. Basically, the public was irrelevant, almost all of it. And when you get to the business world, extreme wealth and so on, then you have enormous influence. Actually, creation of policy, because they usually staff the executive, either they or their representatives. Somebody like, say, Henry Kissinger, representative of the corporate system, but state corporate system. But this is the way it works, and that's considered appropriate in progressive democratic theory for the good of the population. Always, it's out of benevolence. Mm-hmm. You cannot let these ignorant and meddlesome outsiders make bad decisions. It'd be terrible. When you look at the secrecy system, that's what a lot of it is about. I'd say the overwhelming majority, keeping the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders in the dark. It's not their business.
Because you think that, for example, what happened with Snowden, that he leaked all these documents, you think that the fact that if this information reaches the masses, which is not sure also, we don't know if they're really aware of the full extent and of the political implications, you think it could empower them, or do you think they're anyway marginalized by the system and it would be maybe the upper classes that need also this information?
Well, I think the passionate attack on Snowden, as soon as this started, it was high-level claims that we're going to hunt him to the end of the world and we'll catch him wherever he is and we'll punish him. I mean, it shows that they're really afraid. Now, it could be that the fear is paranoia. So, for example, if at the highest level, say, the White House and so on, if they had simply disregarded him, it might have just disappeared. Possible. So their own paranoia may be feeding the system, their own demise in a sense. But it does reflect the attitudes. How much effect it can have, well, we're not sure. So, for example, there were effects. Brazil, for example, withdrew a presidential visit. Didn't quite break relations, but certainly harmed them. And remember, a lot of these Snowden revelations are not just about surveillance of people. They're also about support for corporate efforts to undermine business in other countries. So spying on, the negotiators in energy deals to make sure that American corporations have a head up on it and so on. Now, big corporations in other countries don't like that. Just like Merkel doesn't like the fact that somebody's reading her email. But powerful people and powerful institutions are being harmed sufficiently so that there was a reaction. Congress did start to get concerned when it turned out that the Senate committees responsible for this were being spied on. I should say there's absolutely nothing new about this. So, for example, you go back to the foundation of the United Nations. There was a conference in San Francisco, I think it was 1947, which established the United Nations. Well, it turned out pretty soon that they discovered that the FBI had been bugging the offices of the foreign delegations so that American negotiators could have a step up on trying to get what they wanted. It's a huge fuss made when the Russians do this to the American embassy, of course, but it's done all the time.
At this geopolitical scale, I had a question, coming back to what you said about Philippines and the fact that the strategy put in place by the US has still effects more than 100 years later. How can we explain that Latin America has been one of the strongest, has had one of the strongest reactions to all these mass surveillance, whereas we know that the US always has a very...
Actually, it's a very significant phenomenon, really historic significance. For 500 years, Latin America had been pretty much in the hands of foreign powers. And elite, mostly white elites, tiny elites inside Latin America who accumulated enormous wealth and huge, horrendous poverty in basically rich societies, and always with under the hands of the imperial powers. For a long time it was England, and last century or so it's the United States. Latin America was so taken for granted in U.S. planning that they really hardly even had plans for it. So there were some. So, for example, in 1945, when the U.S. was beginning the organization of the world at the end of the Second World War, the U.S. did call a hemispheric conference in Mexico, and the Latin American states came, and the United States imposed, at that point the U.S. could actually impose what it wanted, imposed what was called an economic charter for the Americas, which banned economic nationalism in all its forms. The Latin American countries had to follow, had to be completely open societies, which of course in fact meant open to U.S. penetration and control. It wasn't reciprocal. And incidentally, the U.S. itself did not accept these principles. On the contrary, it had a high level of economic nationalism. That's why you have your computer and you're using the internet and so on, all largely state sector actions. And this was, they were concerned at the time with what the State Department called the new nationalism in Latin America, which is driven by the idea that the people of the country ought to be the beneficiaries of their resources. Now we have to smash this down. No new nationalism. That's foreign investors who are the beneficiaries, not the people of the country. It was pretty explicit. And at that point, you could just legislate it, and they did what they were told. And so it continued, and not without violence. So, for example, in the post-Stalin period, violence and repression in the U.S. dependencies in Latin America was much worse than in Eastern Europe, much worse. See an indication of it up there, the depiction of the murder of an archbishop in El Salvador, and 10 years later the murder of 6 leading Latin American intellectuals by forces pretty much armed and trained by the United States. East Europe was bad enough, but things like that didn't happen. And there were vicious neo-Nazi dictatorships installed and massive torture and so on. That was Latin America until about 10 or 15 years ago. And since then there's been a sharp turn. Partly it was the effect of the neoliberal policies of the 1980s and 90s. Latin America followed the rules, and it was smashed. The rules are very destructive. Countries that didn't follow the rules, like South Korea and Taiwan and so on, they did fine. But Latin America observed them, and it was a very harsh couple of decades, and there was a reaction. There was also finally a reaction to the U.S.-backed or sometimes U.S.-imposed dictatorships, and for a variety of reasons in the last roughly decade, 20 years maybe, Latin America has, for the first time in its history, moved towards, first of all, integration, some degree of integration of the countries. They were very separate from one another, and a degree of independence. And it's pretty remarkable. What you described here in the NSA is one example, but there are many others. One of the most striking examples had to do with the CIA torture programs. The worst torture programs, by far, were what was called extraordinary rendition. That's a program where you take somebody you're interested in, you suspect him or you think he has information, you send him to your favorite dictatorship, Assad in Syria, and Mubarak in Egypt, Gaddafi in Libya, and make sure that he's tortured sufficiently so that he comes out with something. And then, maybe you have some information, maybe not. There was a study recently, about a year ago, of the countries that participated in extraordinary rendition. Most of Europe, England, Sweden, all participated, probably Italy, I don't remember. The Middle East, of course, because that's where you sent them to be tortured, and most of the rest of the world. One exception, no participation from Latin America, which is doubly significant. First of all, because Latin America used to be the backyard. They did what they were told. Secondly, because during the period of U.S. control, Latin America was one of the world's centers of torture. Now they refuse to participate in U.S.-run torture. It's pretty significant.
Even Colombia?
Even Colombia. You take a look at there are now hemispheric conferences. Used to be the U.S. gave the orders and everybody followed them. The latest ones, the U.S. and Canada are isolated. It's Latin America against the U.S. and Canada. And there's already organizations formed, CELAC, which exclude North America, just the Latin American, Caribbean countries. That's a remarkable change. And the U.S. has simply lost control of the region.
And it's interesting for a European, because on the contrary, I mean, it's maybe a perception, but we see Europe down every time getting more
Europe is becoming Latin Americanized.
It's very.
It was pretty dramatic with the case of the Morales Plain. This is Bolivia, poorest country in the hemisphere outside of Haiti, a country with indigenous majority. The president went to Russia to talked to Snowden flew back. The European countries are so terrified of the United States that they wouldn't let him cross their airspace. They're cowering in terror, the Europeans, because the master might be angry at them. Meanwhile, Latin America, the poorest country in South America, is defying the United States. It's pretty remarkable.
It's very troubling also.
It should tell the Europeans something about their cowardice.
That's, and yeah, especially since we come from, I mean, there was a period, and during the, because you can understand that in the Cold War, there could be like a legitimizing, I mean, could legitimize the influence of the US, but it's, for example, in France, it's especially since the end of the Cold War that there's been this alignment, like they enter NATO without, and it's difficult to understand what happened actually, what was the,
France
the treatment.
First of all, during the Cold War, remember that part of the reason for NATO, significant part, was to keep Europe under control.
Mm.
As long as you had NATO, Europe's dependent on the United States. And efforts to move in an independent direction, which did exist, de Gaulle, Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, others, were very much feared in the United States. There was fear of what was called a third force. Russia, the United States, and Europe had become a third independent force, which it could have. Europe's population is bigger than the United States, and advanced industrial societies, in many ways more advanced than the United States. If Europe wanted to, it could become an independent force, and the U.S. didn't want that. And that's, I think, a large part of the reason why NATO remains and is even expanding, though there's no Russian threat. They can try to concoct one, but it's ludicrous. It's partly to just keep Europe under control. So yes, there was, pressure to. You could imagine the effectiveness of propaganda about legitimizing U.S. influence, but if you look into it, it's pretty shaky. What's happened since? I'm going to say take France. France is quite interesting. Until the 1970s, the French intellectuals were the last Stalinists in the world. Fanatic Stalinists and Maoists. I mean, nobody in the world, in the West, believed any of this, but they were still mouthing all the slogans. I remember giving talks in France. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, talking to the leading French intellectuals about the genius Mao and so on and so forth. In the mid-70s, this radically changed. As far as I can tell, it changed. The event that changed it was probably Solzhenitsyn's Gulag. That was translated into French. Everybody read it. And since the French intellectuals have to be in the lead in the world, because after all it's France, they suddenly presented themselves as the first people in the world who understood the evils of Stalinism. And these great intellectuals were writing articles with great self-praise about things that I knew when I was 10 years old, because everybody knew them. But there were obviously factors behind it, but there was a shift among the intellectual classes from a weird form of Stalinism, Third Worldism, Maoism, and so on. Not everyone, of course, but a substantial part, to becoming the most reactionary sector of the Western intellectuals. And of course, praising themselves for their magnificence and discovering what everybody always knew. In fact, it's kind of comical when you look at the predictions. And it continues like that. It's a very strange, there's this kind of a strain of hysteria in the culture, which is interesting to investigate. I think a lot of the postmodern, sometimes say excesses, grow out of that. But and you had similar things happening in the other countries. What the reasons are, well, it'll be interesting to investigate, but the tendencies are clear.
I wanted to ask you about coming back to this question of we talked yesterday also about the way, I mean, can we resist legally, or do we have to resist legally, or and there is a question, for example, secret services escape by nature to the public scrutiny, and in a way, is it possible to control them like through democratic means? I mean,
the secret services?
Yes, there's like a contradiction between the democracy and
it should be controlled. And not just the secret services, but things like, say, Gladio, which is still largely secret. Some bits and pieces of it have come out. It did appear to be involved in the neo-fascist terror in Italy in the 70s and so on, probably other things. But there's not much research. Daniel Ganser in Switzerland is one of the few researchers. But that should be publicly exposed and under public control. And the same with the secret services. In the United States, after the NSA exposures, there were some measures passed in Congress to limit or restrict the right of the executive to, say, spy on Americans, but very limited. But that's really a question of public pressure. If there's enough, it can be eliminated.
But you still believe that in a broader way, I mean, because we're in an era in which the state is a universal form. Did you ever question the fact that we needed a state as
a state altogether?
Yes, like or at the national, or just at the national level. I think
all my life. That's why since childhood I've been very much attracted by anarchist ideas. The nation state is not some kind of universal property. It's a special construction, mainly in Europe, spread over the world with European imperialism and settlement. And it's in many ways a very destructive system. So take the Middle East, which is falling apart and raging chaos. Largely this is a long-term effect of the imposition of a nation-state system by the European imperial powers, mostly England and France, for their own interests, not for the interests of the people. So take, say, Iraq. Iraq was patched together by the British after the Second World War, the First World War, when they were kind of parceling out the former Ottoman Empire. It was put together in such a way as to, the boundaries were drawn by Britain to ensure that England, not Turkey, would have control of the oil fields near the Turkish border. And Kuwait was established as a British-run principality, primarily in order to bar Iraq's free access to the sea. So mechanism control. And that put together Shiites, Sunnis, Kurds, other minorities, Turkmen, who weren't particularly hostile, but had basically not much to do with each other. This is done for imperial interest. The same was true of the French took Syria, Lebanon, did the same thing. The British took Palestine for geostrategic reasons primarily. It was kind of like a cover of the Bible, said this and that, but the whole region's in turmoil. And if you look around, look at Africa, there's violence everywhere. Almost all of it, when you look at it, has to do with the nation-state systems that were imposed by the European powers for their own interests, drawing lines that broke tribes in half, let's say, and putting people together who were hostile. Or take, say, Pakistan and Afghanistan. The British, during the days when they ruled India, drew a line, the Durand Line, for their interests. That was going to be British India, separate from the rest. The Durand Line it now separates Pakistan from Afghanistan. It cuts right through the Pashtun territories, right through. Some of them are in Pakistan, some are in Afghanistan. When a tribesman, say, goes from Pakistan to Afghanistan to visit relatives, we can call it a terrorist attack and send drones to kill them. But from their point of view, that's their country. Imperial power is broken in half. In fact, the same is true of the U.S. and Mexico. The U.S. conquered about half of Mexico in a brutal war of aggression in the mid-19th century. The border was pretty artificial. The same people lived on both sides. It was a very permeable border. All kinds of developments, but it wasn't until pretty recently, late 80s and 1990s, that the border started to get militarized. And the militarization of the border, in fact, took a big step forward when NAFTA was enacted. 1994, when Clinton rammed through NAFTA over public opposition. He also started militarizing the border because planners could easily understand that NAFTA is going to create a huge number of refugees in Mexico. The Mexican campesinos can be quite efficient, but they can't compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness. And the same is true more generally. So you're going to get a flow of refugees. You have to militarize the border. Now, big issue, people crossing the border, shoot them, send them back, and so on. And this is all over the world. So there's nothing natural about the nation-state system. I mean, you can see how unnatural it is by looking at European history. The centuries during which this system was imposed were some of the most savage centuries in human history. I mean, the 30 Years' War, and maybe a third of the population of Germany was slaughtered. This is all part of imposing nation-state systems. And finally, in 1945, the Europeans did recognize that the next time they play their favorite game of slaughtering each other, it's going to be the end. So Europe did finally move towards some kind of integration, which began to somewhat erode the nation-state borders, which are generally pretty artificial. And I think it's a positive direction. It should take place elsewhere in the world.
But at the same time, it creates an even more important distance between the people who are because your thoughts are always about this relationship of power between established power and society. And for example, we can see in Europe how the distancing between both has created even more difficulties to grasp politics for the society.
Because other developments are taking place. Like one of the things that's happening in the more integrated Europe is a very sharp attack on popular democracy. Decisions are being made in Brussels by the bureaucrats and the Bundesbank, and are imposed on the countries. When Monti was elected in Italy, the population had almost nothing to do with him. It came from Brussels. When the Greek Prime Minister, Papandreou, had the effrontery to suggest that you might ask the population, do they want the policies? There was fury all over Europe. How dare you ask the population? This is decided by the responsible men in Brussels. And I mean, even the Wall Street Journal had an article pointing out that no matter what political party took power in Europe, right to left, they always followed the same policies because they're not coming from the country. So that's another tendency. Things don't happen just mechanically. There's a lot of things going on. I'm afraid I have to.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.